with the armor-piercing bullets of me little Armalite. And it's sewn in the new lodge, it's where I long to be, lying in the dark with the Provo Company. A comrade on me left and another one on me right, a clip of ammunition for me little Armalite.
The AR-180 is a semi-auto civilian legal version of the selective-fire AR-18. With this rifle, the story of the people who used it is just as relevant as the technical details of the weapon itself. Although the AR-180 was a commercial failure, it did become infamous by its association with a certain separatist group called the Provisional IRA, or Irish Republican Army, sometimes called Provos. The Troubles. The IRA smuggled thousands of AR-18s and AR-180s into Northern Ireland during a 30-year time period from 1968 to roughly 1998 that became known as the Troubles. The Troubles was a low-intensity, asymmetric conflict defined by government oppression, guerrilla tactics, and horrific political violence against civilians. To clarify, the word Republican in IRA meant that they wanted independence from Britain, which, as an American, I can understand. But don't let the Republican in IRA fool you. The IRA was actually a far-left, socialist, even communist group. The IRA fought to be free from Britain's tyranny so that they could jump into the tyranny of socialism and communism, which never works no matter how many times we try it. Come on, guys, we've ran this experiment before. Just to make sure I offend both sides equally, I should also point out the foolishness of the Sterling Armament Company of Great Britain literally manufacturing thousands of Armalite rifles that did end up in IRA hands, thereby building the actual weapons that became the symbol of resistance against their own country. Jokes aside, there were innocent people on both sides who lost their lives, and the Troubles was just the latest stanza of an almost 900-year-long tragedy of British occupation of Ireland. Why were they fighting? Disclaimer. I am an American studying the Troubles as an outsider who saw some of these events happen on TV and in newspaper headlines during the 1980s and 1990s. Recently, I did do a deep dive on the subject for this presentation, but I am not an expert. My information is incomplete and is subject to my own bias and errors. With innocent lives lost on both sides and living memories still fresh, every source does seem biased to me. My statements about a certain nation's or other nations' foreign policy decisions do not directly reflect on the average citizen in either country. I view the whole thing as a human tragedy. I've done a little bit of research on the Troubles, but to really understand this time period, you need to understand that England's heavy-handed rule of Ireland contributed to at least 1 million Irish men, women, and children starving to death a century before during the Irish potato famine of 1845 to 1852. Prior to this famine, most Irish people lived in abject poverty, barely surviving, while absentee British landlords charged the Irish people high rent, putting the Irish citizenry into a de facto lifelong slavery, barely surviving as it was. In contrast, the perspective of the average British citizen was probably closer to something like this. There we were, having a pint when the Irish attacked us for no reason. The average English subject probably didn't understand the hardships of Ireland, and they also didn't directly or knowingly profit from those exploits. Sure, the British nobility grew rich on Irish suffering, but it's not like those greedy elites shared those gains fairly with their own peasants either. By and large, the default English view, then and now, is that the IRA was a violent terrorist organization. Ireland's struggle with England goes back almost 1,000 years to the Norman invasion of Ireland in 1169 AD. To be fair to the British, though, the Normans had taken over England a century prior, so pretty much all of world history is violent and very unfair. From my albeit limited understanding, the British-Irish seemed to be a repeating pattern of the following. British nobility exploit the Irish. Irish conduct violent uprisings and terror campaigns. British retaliate by committing massacres of their own. This cycle of violence seems to repeat generationally for around the last 900-ish years. I do not support the IRA. I do not support the IRA's violence against civilians, but I do understand why people would not want to be ruled by England. As an American, my solution to tyranny is a lot different than the IRA's, which is I want to have less government, more freedom, because America. In this video, you'll see me using a mask and the rifles and stuff shown in this video because they are historically relevant to the Troubles and the AR-18, so I'm including them as props and not endorsement of political movements or actions. So what's the cultural meaning of the Armalite? Much like the Kentucky long rifle of the American Revolution, the so-called Little Armalite became a symbol of freedom and the IRA's resistance to Britain during the Troubles. The Little Armalite became so entwined in Northern Ireland's struggle for independence that it even made its way into local folk music. Songs like Kinky Boots and Me Little Armalites became pub favorites that expressed a passionate defiance against English rule that goes back centuries in Irish history. Irish rebellion songs during the Troubles had themes of both open calls to arms and of feigned support for England, delivered in a sarcastic and mocking tone. There also seems to be themes of Irish rebellion songs written from the perspective of unlucky and ill-fated British soldiers and Unionists who sympathized with the British, who wanted to stay under English rule. Listening to the recordings of these pub songs, often sung by friends and families in small pubs and living rooms, it helps add color to the generations of pain and sadness experienced by many in Northern Ireland. Although Me Little Armalite was the most commonly recognized service rifle of the IRA, truth be told, the IRA used whatever weapons they could smuggle in. There's pictures and videos of IRA insurgents using A1 and A2 variants of the M16 and AR-15. I even saw a picture of a Tommy gun used by IRA, various revolvers, AKs, even Barrett 50 cals, Dishka belt feds, and really anything else they could find. Compared to the M16, the Armalite offered a lower price, lighter weight, folding stock, and a shorter barrel. These factors made it a favorite for guerrilla warfare and concealment tactics used in the conflict by a militant group that also lacked state funding to afford nicer rifles. An unwise decision. Developed by Eugene Stoner and others through the Armalite Company in 1963, the AR-18/180 was intended to be a more affordable alternative to the, at the time, more expensive AR-15. More than just making a cheaper AR, Armalite was also motivated to make the AR-18 as a means of regaining market share that they had foolishly ceded to Colt. As chance would have it, under pressure from parent company Fairchild Defense, Armalite gave up on the AR-15 design and sold the plans and the rights to manufacture it over to their competitor, Colt. Once Colt owned the rights to the AR-15, Colt won the military contract, and the M16 rifle based on the AR-15 became the U.S. military's primary service rifle, selling millions of AR-15-based units over multiple decades, even to this day. Once Armalite realized that they had sold off the AR-15, M16, M4 cash cow right before it became the most popular civilian rifle of all time, as well as one of the longest-serving infantry rifles in world history. Yes, I know that the OG Garbage Rod Mosin Nagant has technically been in service longer, but Enemy at the Gates was a long time ago, and nobody really cares anyway. This left Armalite without a widely adopted military rifle to sell. And Armalite was very buttered about this. But, as the luck of the Irish would have it, there was this one group that did end up liking Armalite, and they liked them quite a lot. Enter the AR-18. Armalite decided to compete against their own AR-15 M16 design, which Colt now owned because they had sold it to them. They decided to compete on price and manufacturing capability by using cheaper stamped and spot-welded metal parts, while still maintaining ammo commonality with the more expensive M16. The thinking was to arm US allies with a lower-cost, mass-produced rifle. In the 1950s and 60s, stamping metal components was much cheaper than milling. In contrast, in the current year, milling metal components is exponentially easier due to the development of CNC technology. This means that in today's economic climate, a stamped and spot-welded firearm is actually harder and more expensive to produce than a milled one. First impression. When I first saw this rifle, I was immediately drawn to it. The receiver contours and finish are strikingly beautiful. Picking up the Armalite, I was actually shocked at how light this rifle actually is. As I began to inspect the controls, test out the trigger, magazine release, folding mechanism for the stock, couldn't help but marvel at the crude, fragile functionality of the design. Shooting the rifle, I was surprised at how accurate it is. But I was also greatly disappointed by the trigger. The rifle definitely works, but it feels so delicate that you could honestly break it just by dropping it onto a hard surface. Design. Using thin, stamped, and spot-welded sheet metal, the AR-18/180 is much lighter than other stamped receiver designs like the AK-47 and its derivatives. Unlike the AR-15's direct gas impingement, the AR-18 uses a short-stroke gas piston to cycle the action. This design allows the rifle's lightweight polymer stock to fold because there's no need for a buffer tube. The most immediately obvious design cue of the AR-180 has to be the reciprocating charging handle, which has a distinctive upward sweep, almost like the Israeli Galil. Like the M16, the AR-18/180 does have a dust cover that flips out of the way when the action is cycled. The magazines look very similar to the M16's, but they are retained via a small cut in the side of the magazine, so they are not quite interchangeable. Although some will choose to modify a Stanag M16 pattern magazine to work in an AR-180, there's others that report that this can cause some problems. Other nuanced differences include the AR-18's lower sight height over bore, and the inclusion of a factory dovetail by which to attach a very crude, optional optic. Sidebar about the AR-18 sights. I kinda hate them. Unlike the M16's iron sights, which feature a larger diameter peep sight for faster aiming at close range, the AR-18 has two sight options that account for bullet drop, but both have tiny apertures, as somebody in my comments didn't really understand that an AR-18 does not have M16 sights. Anyway, the small aperture and the low height over bore makes these sights useless for close-range shooting, so I found myself just point shooting it like a shotgun. If this rifle wasn't a piece of history, I would very quickly take a drill and drill out the close-range aperture, probably on day one. The separation of the upper and lower receivers is somewhat similar to the AR/M16. The AR-18 uses a recoil spring tension instead of a rear pin, and the upper and lower are not compatible with the AR/M16. In an effort to make the rifle as affordable as possible, the Armalite rifle takes stamped parts to a whole new level. For example, components like the hammer and magazine release are stamped, not cast or milled like you'd see on an AR-15. The result of all these thin metal stampings is a rifle that does feel very lightweight, but also very cheap and fragile. The worst design execution of the AR-18 is definitely the folding and latching mechanism on the buttstock. As I think it was Forgotten Weapons pointed out, maybe it was Brandon Herrera, the plastic stocks and forends on the AR-18 and 180 were made by the Mattel Toy Company, which explains a lot. In general, the rifle works, but it feels like it would easily break under hard use. Overall, the Armalite feels cheaply made and fragile compared to the M16. Interestingly, the bolt carrier on the AR-18/180 travels along recoil spring guideposts, so it's not actually in contact with inside surfaces or tracks in the actual firearm receiver. This design choice was intentional, and the idea was to help make the action more resistant to fouling and debris. Despite the AR-180's cheap and fragile construction, this one hasn't jammed on me in the 400 to 500 rounds I've sent down it during testing. Keep in mind, I haven't truly ran this rifle hard because at this point, this is a piece of history, not serious go-time kit. But for what it is, the AR-180 is surprisingly accurate, offering similar but not quite as good as tested field accuracy to well-built AR-15s of the time from Colt. The Colt is definitely a bit more accurate, but that accuracy performance gap is not as big as you might think. The trigger feel on the AR-18/180 is heavy, unrefined, and clunky. Trigger quality is a bit less important on a full send version, but in the world of Geissele match triggers allowing for extremely fast, semi-auto fire, the AR-180 really sucks. Let's talk about the BRN-180. In the year 2019, Brownells released a modernized concept of the AR-18/180 with the release of its BRN-180 milled upper receiver, which is incidentally compatible with standard AR-15 lowers or available with a folding stock lower that has a few AR-180-ish styling features like the rake of the magazine well. The original AR-18/180 is not compatible with an AR-15 lower receiver, but the newer Brownells BRN-180 actually is. One note about the BRN-180 upper, is it does not have a full auto bolt carrier group, which kind of stinks because even if you did put it on a post sample or another registered lower, you would not get it to go into full send mode without welding or adding some kind of provision for a sear trip. The newer BRN 180 kept the iconic reciprocating charging handle and some of the overall design cues, the overall bolt design, and some visual styling, but that seems about where the actual similarities end. I have found the BRN 180 to be fairly accurate with irons or a red dot sight. I was able to hit sporting clays on a berm, standing, offhand at 40 to 70 yards, so I would definitely call it fighting accurate. And for the most part, the Brownells retro build has been reliable, but after this rifle spends a few months in the safe unfired, this rifle did tend to dry out, as in the oil just kind of dripped out of it, and it became a jam factory until I got frustrated with it and sprayed some WD-40 into the open breech, and since then it's been happy. The only real advantage of the BRN 180 seems to be its strong support for a folding stock, as in you can fire it with a folding stock, unlike some of the law folders and things like that you'll see with AR-15s to try and get them to fold. You'd probably be better off, most people, with a mil-spec direct impingement AR-15 from a good manufacturer. The BRN 180 is kind of a range toy. Reception. Unfortunately for Armalite, sales were very limited, and the major NATO military contracts didn't really show up in numbers, and I kind of understand why, unfortunately. The AR-18 was originally manufactured in Costa Mesa, California, in low volume in the 1960s and 70s. Concurrently, the design was also shipped overseas, first to Japan to be manufactured under Howa from 1970 to 1974, although changes in Japanese laws ended that production run. Later on, with irony not lost on me, Great Britain's Sterling Armament produced AR-180s like the one in this video between 1979 and 1985. This example is co-branded as both Armalite and Sterling. It does seem a little odd to me that Britain literally made the preferred weapon of their enemies, but we are all willing participants in our own undoing, unfortunately. Finally, in 1983, Alisco Tool and Manufacturing in the Philippines bought out Armalite and produced a modified AR-18 design, but production halted after a few years when Alisco failed to garner a military contract with the Philippine Army. All in all, it seems like only about 21,000 to 22,000 AR-18/180s were produced. Based on my math, it appears that as much as 15% of that total manufacturing did end up in the hands of the IRA. Certainly, militaries around the world appreciated some design features of the AR-18, but the rifle was never a top choice for nation-state, unless you count Botswana, Haiti, and Malaysia. But do people really count those? Influence on future design. Although the AR-180 is generally considered a commercial failure, AR-180-inspired short-stroke gas piston designs lived on in subsequent rifles, like the HK-G36, HK-416, the FN Scar, Steyr AUG, British SA-80, and other rifles. The AR-18 is a very interesting design, and I really do appreciate it from an engineering perspective. It is lightweight, very affordable, and a lot more stowable than M16, A1s, and A2s of the time. The AR-18 makes perfect sense for a guerrilla warfare fighter, but the cheap and fragile design elements make it a substandard choice as a primary service rifle for a nation-state with adequate funding. Clothing. The AR-180 is more than a commercially unsuccessful rifle. It's an iconic piece of history that became a symbol entwined with a great deal of human suffering that goes back a lot further than the Troubles. In a world of Gucci military-grade rifles, the AR-180's trigger is garbage, and the build quality feels like it's made of tinfoil that you could easily break over your knee if you got angry at it. Even still, using the supplied factory magazine, this rifle has never jammed on me, and it's a lot more accurate than you'd expect. If you have options, don't expect the AR-18 or 180 to be a top-tier fighting rifle. On the other hand, if you want to hold a fascinating piece of human history in your hands that can still make it happen if you really need it to, then consider the AR-180 or AR-18 as a fun and functional collector's piece. Luke 21:25. There will be great signs in the sun, moon, and stars. On the earth, nations will be in anguish and perplexity at the roaring and tossing of the sea. Thank you.
He wishes to blazes he was back in jail again. Oh, I've got a brand new shiny helmet and a pair of kinky boots. I've got a lovely new flak jacket and a lovely khaki suit. And when we go on night patrol, we hold each other's hands. We are the British Army and we're here to take your land.